The Spanish Civil War, first of the ideological wars of our times, began in 1936, when the right-wing army of one Colonel Francisco Franco rebelled against the Republican government in a struggle that lasted 2.5 years, with the world watching. Before the Spanish War ended, leaving 1 million dead, it had cut a chasm through all Europe's loyalties and assumptions. It divided friend from friend and brother from brother and father from son, and not only in Spain, but in every country where the confrontation of right and left was coming to a head. Not all the world was content to watch. Nazi Germany and fascist Italy used Spain, only on Franco's side, as a rehearsal ground for the greater war to come. When Franco and his rebel armies landed from Morocco, a large part of Spain declared for his side. The rest of Spain, under the legal government, appealed to the world for help. Britain, however, was officially committed to non-intervention, as it was called. Nevertheless, hundreds of men and women took arms as individuals in what they judged to be the cause of freedom and what others judged to be the cause of communism. They united in an irregular army of many nationalities and origins in what was known as the International Brigade. Britain in the 30s was a somber and uneasy place, taking its temper from the Great Depression that had thrown 4 million on the dole and bred a mood of disenchantment and dismay that was only too ready to polarize into politics. The British working men, themselves frustrated and angry, heard the cry for help from their fellows in Spain and answered in hundreds. In years to come, an illusion grew somehow that the International Brigade was an army of radical romantics and middle-class Marxists. Not so. The British volunteers were overwhelmingly workers, politically minded to be sure, projecting their own distress onto the resistance of the working people of Spain, who at least were fighting for something. But the British official policy of non-intervention put a barrier against the volunteers. The government invoked an 1870 law against foreign enlistment, but this did not prevent hundreds from doing so. The British members of the brigade who remember it are not impartial witnesses to history. Was anyone impartial in the Spanish War? They were committed people then and are still, though the commitment is long ago and far away. One of them was a London furrier's assistant, Tony Gilbert.
I don't think anybody was ever recruited for the International Brigade, so far as I know. You volunteered. And I volunteered after a meeting at the People's Palace. The speaker was Isabel Brown, and she was a fantastic woman. She could really make you feel that fighting fascism, the men and women that were fighting fascism in Spain were really fighting to protect the peace of the world. And it was after listening to her that I had no hesitation. The following morning, I was working for a change. One worked only 3 to 4 months in a year in those days, if one was lucky enough to do so. But I asked the boss for time off and went straight down to the International Brigade office to volunteer.
In order to circumvent the British law against foreign enlistment, the volunteers used all manner of stratagems, chiefly by going first to France as weekend tourists who needed no passports. 2 of them were Jim Prendergast and Will Painter. Jim Prendergast was a railwayman trade unionist.
But I've never seen such a most unlikely bunch of tourists in all my life. They were dressed in riding breeches. They looked like the equivalent of the modern IRA, and the special constant policemen, the CID, were looking at them very suspiciously. So we went.
Many of the volunteers were unemployed Welsh miners. A famous miners' trade unionist was Will Painter.
Well, I had this weekend ticket to Paris, and I was met by Charlotte Haldane, Professor Haldane's wife. I think it was a Nicosia that we had as an assembly point.
The clandestine route from Paris to Spain was organized by one Josip Broz. Later, he was to have a more public fame as Marshal Tito, president of Yugoslavia. The French, too, had their official non-intervention policy, and their Spanish frontier was carefully controlled. Perhaps not too carefully. A lot of the strictness was for the record, and many got through. It wasn't too easy for Will Painter, however.
Some guides came over from Spain, and we had to take our boots off. We were given some rope sandals that we put on, and we started the climb up over the Pyrenees, and had to be very silent because we were passing a French garrison. We got into Spain by daylight the following morning.
And I was whacked. We were all singing, I suppose. There were about 400 volunteers. French, German, Italians, Bulgarians. And each was singing their national songs. And in the middle of it all, there was a air raid alert. When the bombs began to fall, there were no air raid shelters, and we were told to run for the open fields. Less chance of casualties. We turned around and laughed at each other. There were 2 volunteers to Spain. And there we were, holding hands like like 2 young kids. I suppose for each, to help each other over our own feelings. We didn't realize it until we looked around at each other. But there it is, that's what we were. We weren't really soldiers, and we really didn't know what we were letting ourselves in for.
Marching with the brigade squaddies in Spain was less soul-destroying and no harder than hunger marching from Jarrow. It was a real scratch job to begin with, the brigade, a pretty motley army from 20 nations with only one thing in common between them, a total and complete inexperience of the crafts of war. They knew more or less what they were fighting for, but how to do it was something they had to learn, and a very hard way it was for some.
You've seen how tall I am. I'm 5 foot nothing. And the first thing I had to do with the overcoat, and it was February or March, I'm not sure which, and it was fairly cold. Everybody thinks of Spain as a hot country, but Spain can be devilishly cold first thing in the morning and during the night. And the first thing I had to do was cut about half the bottom of the coat off.
Naturally, the great upholder of the Republican cause in Britain was the Daily Worker. Its war correspondent, already in Spain watching the government's resistance to Franco's rebellion, was Frank Pitcairn, better known today by his real name, Claude Cockburn.
It rained and it rained and it rained. They had all got the impression that they were going to sunny Spain. They'd all seen the posters. And the main source of discontent and grumbling and so on, all armies grumble, but the grumblings of these people were the feeling that somehow they'd been swindled by the weather.
So this amateur army of miners and dockers and railwomen and poets and political philosophers got down to the business of learning how to be soldiers in a foreign field. The British and French non-intervention policies meant that Spain was deprived of all official arms supplies. Its international brigade used what it could.
We were armed with, they talked about Russian arms, we didn't have them then. We had Austrian Steer rifles, 50 years old, and they usually blew back, the breech block blew back into your face. And we had French chauchals, called them chauchals, with a half moon. They never worked anyways.
Fortunes were made in those days by private arms dealers, bootlegging obsolete weapons to the Spaniards. The recruits went up the line after sometimes only 4 days' training. A couple of weeks was supposed to make a veteran. There simply wasn't time to do things properly because Franco's wholly professional and mercenary army was making headway fast. One of the early engagements involving the British battalion was the Battle of Brunetti.
And it was a terrible battle. The counterattack came from the fascists when the arms, the tanks and aeroplanes that were supporting the British advance, or the advance of the 15th International Brigade, had to be taken away to another part of the front, with the result that there was a tremendous concentration against the troops, our troops.
The first time you hear a shell explode, first time you hear it cutting the air, let alone the explosion, well, it was for me a tremendously frightening experience. Your stomach just turns to water. And perhaps this happens to every soldier when he first hears metal tearing through the air and knows it's liable to be his finish.
And there were a lot killed. I think there were 30 Britons killed in that particular battle over 3 or 4 days. And there were a number of desertions. I'm bound to say there were problems in the leadership of the British battalion at the time, which contributed to some extent to the desertions. There were also personal problems. Letters coming from home to some of the lads, where the girlfriend was threatening to find some other friend, you know, where the wife was in desperation because of the lack of finance. Well, the effect of this sort of thing it depressed the morale, and they deserted. Some got back to Britain and told their story to the press here. Others, of course, failed to get back, and they were arrested. It was part of my job to get them from prison. And we had big discussions with the International Brigade, because in a war there is one penalty for a deserter, and it's usually a pretty severe physical penalty.
If you remember, well, in Albacete,
yeah,
we had about 50, I think it was, maybe not quite 50, about 30 deserters who turned up. And our attitude was very humane. And Will asked me, I don't know why, Will, to speak with these lads. And we said, well, we understand the problem. So we didn't shoot them.
Those people were always treated with the greatest sympathy, and because of the institution of political commissars in the brigade, which meant to some extent political schoolmasters, every attempt was made to explain to those people how these things really worked, and to show them where theory and practice really intermesh.
People sneered at the idea of political officers. In fact, even in the International Brigade, I was a minor political officer, not quite so important as Will, but they called us political comic stars, you know. And this was as a result of the influence of the sneers of the right-wing press in this country. But they forgot their own history, because Cromwell's army had political officers.
And indeed, I must say that as a result of political rehabilitation, the bulk of the lads who did desert went back to the battalion, and were with the battalion until the end, or until they were killed.
Probably no foreign political war before had ever engaged so many people in active work. In Britain, committees for Spanish aid sprang up everywhere, sometimes expressly communist and sometimes not. Somebody had to organize them, and one of these people was Bessie Wilde.
We got this committee together that tried to collect money first of all, so that people would have something to exist on, because they were extremely hard up, especially families with young children. It was also very important that we kept up the regular visitation to the families. They were very worried as you saw the heavy casualty lists coming through. And in every way possible, we tried to help.
Most of the British press was bitterly committed against the Spanish government, which they called the Reds, and in favor of the Franco side. In that respect, the British public got a completely inside-out version in which the International Brigade was just one arm of communism.
In Britain, there was an enormous weight as far as the government and the ruling powers were concerned, on the side of Franco. They were terrified of what they thought of as a red victory, and their pretense of neutrality was hypocrisy.
Stories of red atrocities were, of course, staple fare in the pro-Franco newspapers, with rapings of nuns and desecration of churches and so on. And again, many of these stories were true. Churches were desecrated, images were destroyed. The fact was that by now, in the eyes of the government forces, the identification of the Catholic Church with the fascists was practically complete. The bishops and the church hierarchy were felt to be just part and parcel of Franco's army. However, even the most bitterly anti-clerical Spaniards were such ancestral Catholics that while they hated the church, they feared and respected its power, especially the power of its symbols. Claude Coburn remembers one specially powerful gilded image that had to be physically executed.
They didn't just think, well, all that's nonsense and therefore powerless. They continued to believe that this effigy, with its supposed magical powers, had those magical powers, which were directed against them. So they tore down the effigy out of the church. And I think, I'm not sure about this, I think they fired a few shots at it. But then somebody said, well, that's no good, just shooting at that thing. That's tremendous power. And they had a little, they ran through the village, one of those little mountain railways, single-track railway. So they brought a kind of puffing billy which ran the railway, and they placed the effigy with its neck on the line, like people in those old films, and they ran the train, got up steam, ran the train down the line, and cut off the head of the effigy. And this, at last, had laid and destroyed the evil power of this object.
Back in Britain, there were much more mundane considerations occupying the Spanish aid groups. As ever, it was mostly about medical supplies.
Very, very quickly indeed, groups started throughout the country rolling bandages. We had medical aid committees collecting money for ambulances. And in almost every town and village, you got this almost spontaneous coming together of people who felt very keenly and saw the problem.
Behind the fighting people of the brigade went the ambulance units and the medical teams. One of the nurses who volunteered for this quite desperate job was Margaret Lesser.
Of course, nurses and doctors were desperately needed. And I was politically very left-wing, and having talked a great deal about it, as young people do, I felt that, well, now this is the time when I must show that I will do something and I'll not only talk about it. And I remember taking a last long look with Walter de la Mare in mind when I crossed London Bridge. Well, I only remember the first line now. Look at last on all things lovely.
The volunteer nurses from all over the place went first to an assembly point in Madrid. Almost at once, Margaret Lesser was posted to a mobile casualty unit for frontline duties. It was not a tidy war, and it was not a tidy job. They were short of everything: doctors, nurses, plasma, drugs, and they were handling the casualties to the sound of the guns.
Men poured in as fast as the few ambulances and trucks that we had to bring them in. I was then in the ward, and the only nurse in the ward, and I had to decide who should be treated. And many died then because I couldn't divide myself into 6. And this was, of course, I think, the most terrible thing that happened to me in all my life.
Two of the international brigaders from Scotland and Manchester were old trade union militants. Sam Wilde was to be wounded 4 times and become the British battalion commander. They remember not just the fighting but the famine, the awful food scarcity that everyone had to share. Because of his trade union experience, Bob Cooney became political commissar.
We stayed twice with this particular family. It was our battalion HQ. Little white building with no windows, but with window space. And it was an old, very emaciated peasant and his family who lived there, a man and a woman and a little girl. And they had a dog they were very fond of. And we...
Full of rickets, the dog.
Yes, yes. And we left there, and when we came back after an absence of about 3 months, we noticed the absence of the dog. He explained that the dog had died, and they'd done the natural thing for people to do in such circumstances. It augmented their very, very more than scanty food supplies.
Food wasn't plentiful, but I think the army would give them whatever was available, and I think the people gave it gladly. The meat we had was, of course, burro. You know what a burro is, I suppose. You know? Cross between a donkey and a mule, I think. I don't know. I'm not sure.
There is a sweet cookhouse not far away, where we get sweet damo 3 times a day. Ham and eggs we never see, damo sugar in our tea, and we are gradually fading away. Old soldiers never die, never die, never die. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away.
The winter of '37 was cruel. It was not what one had expected of Spain, this terrible Siberian snow of Aragon, which held up the Republican advance. This was the Battle of Teruel, where the British had a full company, 145 strong, in the 15th Brigade, and where the bitter cold and poor equipment brought so many casualties, not from Franco, but from frostbite.
And we very frequently had to do amputations, for instance, without anesthetics. But sometimes, one man I can remember very well, who came in, who was brought in and said, you can take it off if it has to come off without an anesthetic. I can bear it. And he did, and he didn't complain, and nobody had to hold him down. The thing that seemed to grieve him most was that he wouldn't be able to fight anymore.
The International Brigade was, of course, never on the winning side. For a year, they thought they were, but they weren't. Their cause of Republican Spain had not just the armies of Franco, but a good deal of the world against it. At least most of the world from which the brigaders had come: England, France, America, Ireland, Poland, and so on. They retreated, and retreat is never nice. And more of Spain fell to the fascists. But somehow, morale remained high.
We faced up to the fact that you couldn't always be advancing. Sometimes things got too much of you, for you. But if you could laugh about this and sing about this, then you didn't get demoralized about it.
Oh, we were great singers. We sang everybody else's songs, and we invented a hell of a lot of our own. The British sang the French songs, the German songs, and of course every single nationality sang the one song which we all loved, and that was the Battle of Jarama.
Shall I sing it? There was a time just after we come home from Spain, I couldn't even listen to the song, you know, without becoming very emotionally overcome. But there's a valley in Spain called Jarama. It's a place that we all know so well. It was there that we gave of our manhood, and most of our brave comrades fell.
Now we're far from that valley of sorrow, but its memory we ne'er will forget. So before we conclude this reunion, let us stand to our glorious dead.
And I can remember in Hill 481, after a most terrible day, in which one company, in the course of that one day, went through 7 different company commanders, right down to a cabo or corporal, who eventually became the commander of that company that day. But the fascists knew we were still in good heart, because we really made the air ring with our singing that night. And you can't do this in the abstract unless you have a certain basic morale already.
On one occasion we were waiting because we couldn't move until we had the official order to move, and we knew if we didn't get it very soon we were going to be captured. Well, this happened to us more than once, but on this occasion we had with us a young man from Andalusia, and as far as I know, I don't know what he did, I never did discover it, but our surgeon said it was worth having him around in any case because he always made us laugh. And there we were waiting and looking anxiously up the road, and all of us quiet. And he ran out in front, and he said the usual, which was the slogan, "No pasarán," they shall not pass. But he, being an Andaluz, said it, "No pasarán," because that's how they pronounce it. He says, "Y si pasan, no nos hablaremos," which means they shall not pass. And he looked up the road and said, and if they do pass, we won't speak to them.
Mussolini's Italians had no inhibitions about non-intervention. Their intervention on Franco's side was quite overt and considerable. They were on the fascist side and didn't care who knew it. Both Italy and Hitler's Germany sent troops and tanks. And part of Germany's contribution was the aerial Condor Legion under General von Sperl.
The air cover that we got was next to none. The air power against us was overwhelming, and in evidence by the numbers that we could see daily. And the role of the Germans and the Italians can't be underestimated in that Spanish War.
Sam Wilde, a veteran of the Invergordon Mutiny, became the final commander of the British battalion. Outside the brigade, individual support for the Republic came from all sorts of quarters. There was Ernest Hemingway from America, the British scientist J.B.S. Haldane, even a conservative student who spoke for the Republican cause whose name was Edward Heath. There was also the Conservative MP, the Duchess of Atholl, whose career was ruined for her principles.
The amazing thing was that despite our lack of numbers in equipment and men, that we was able to put up the resistance we did for so long with such good result.
By now, the Italian and German presence was growing far too strong for the government forces. The sands were beginning to run out for the anti-fascists, and even more quickly for the International Brigade. For Tony Gilbert, the war was almost over.
We marched along this road. We heard this low hum, and then literally hundreds of tanks came from each side of the olive groves. And I suppose in the first few minutes, half of number 1 company was killed. And the whole thing was impossible to continue, and 100 men were captured in that position. Even though we felt dreadful about it, we believed we would be killed. And I think, if not for a complete accident, we would have been. I think if a carload of journalists hadn't arrived at the scene, American journalists they were, I don't believe we would have survived. They'd already pulled out machine guns, they'd already lined them up facing us. And I do think we would have been quickly dealt with. But we weren't shot.
The line of the River Ebro, west of Catalonia, was crossed and recrossed time after time. Much of the fighting of the 15th International Brigade was on the Ebro, trying to restore communications between Catalonia and the rest of Republican Spain. And when Franco's men finally broke the Ebro line, it really meant the end of the war. Just as Britain, ironically, was signing the deal at Munich, so were her citizens of the International Brigade coming slowly to terms with defeat. Yet even now they didn't give up.
There were about 70 of we British left, and he asked us to man one side of this road, just beyond Gandesa. There were a number of Canadians and other elements on the other side of the road. All told, it made up an army of 200 or so, 70 odd with us. And we'd had no food for literally 3 days, but this commissar was kind enough to give me a small tin of corned beef and a loaf of bread from which I shaved rather than cut 70 odd sandwiches, and explained to the lads who'd been through hell for 3 days. They were hungry, they were footsore, their boots and everything else was in a terrible condition. They gave a bloody big cheer and they went up that hill. And incredibly, in spite of 7 tank advances that day, the hill was held. Sam, who had been wounded, had come back to the other side of the Ebro, and discovering that we were apparently cut off and lost, in spite of orders to the contrary, he insisted on getting the battalion cookhouse lorry and the quartermaster hookey walker to get over the Ebro, knowing that the bridge would be blown up behind him.
I got the driver of the lorry to go to the nearest food store, cookhouse, load up, put a couple of light machine gunners onto the lorry, jumps into the cab myself, and just shot past the guards that was on the bridge.
It was very pleasant when we were marching along this road. Suddenly your own lorry pulls up with rations of Hookie Walker's famous rissoles for a whole battalion, and there were only 70 odd of us to eat them, so we'd a right good feed. And when Sam rolled up, well, it was typical. At the same time, it was very, very moving. And you could see, though I don't have any erotic tendencies, it was like a love affair, actually, this reunion.
Viva la Quinta Brigada, rumba la rumba rumba la. Viva la Quinta Brigada, rumba la rumba rumba la.
By the beginning of 1939, about 5,000 men of 29 nationalities had passed through Barcelona on their way home, wherever that might be. In all, something like 13,000 foreigners fought for Republican Spain. 2,000 were British, of whom 500 were killed.
For the first time since we'd left Britain, we saw a station buffet that was loaded with good things: chocolate, butter, good food, and all the rest of it. And we sat down to a meal provided by local members of the French Popular Front. You don't mind if I interpolate this, Sam? In the middle of this meal, the next British consul, the consul from Paris, presented every one of us with a document to sign. I, the undersigned, agree to refund to His Majesty's government the cost of our repatriation from Spain and food en route.
The British volunteers, those who had survived, were welcomed back to England by Major Attlee and Stafford Cripps. Before Sam Wilde gave the last dismissal, the battalion had an English meal, which many of their poor shrunk stomachs were too out of practice to accept. It was not a day of gaiety. Many of the men and women volunteers were always to be bitter at what they thought to be their country's betrayal.
I didn't feel relief at being home. I felt so bitter and angry that I really didn't want to see or speak to anybody except those I knew who felt as I did. It shocked me that I felt like that.
For the foreign volunteers, the war was over. But the Spaniards had to come to terms with a new and harsh regime. Now began over the Pyrenees the thing that in this generation was to become sickeningly repetitive. The refugees, trudging from nowhere to nowhere. Today, almost a cliché of our tormented times, but new enough in the 30s to be still sad. Madrid fell to Franco, and at last, all Spain was in fascist hands. And what did it prove?
It showed that when the working class and the common people in general, by parliamentary means, come within reach of real power and start really to alter the economic situation of a country in their favor, the existing ruling class will fight back by extra parliamentary means.
It was the first democratic government that they'd had, and most people wanted to save the government. There were other people who thought that this was now their chance. They were having a revolution. And this caused a great deal of difficulties.
Certainly, there were vast and highly important political and philosophical differences between the anarchists and the communists. But one must say, first of all, that however deep they were, except in certain crucial situations and towards the very end, the sense of unity against fascism, the sense of the defense of the republic, the defense of democracy and so on, was absolutely overriding.
That we were making history, that we were fighting for Britain no less than for Spain, and that Spain was the dress rehearsal for Hitler's world war, and that we were doing our best to prevent this world war. But in any case, whether the world war came or not, we did succeed in dislocating Hitler's timetable by 3 years.
You see, we saw the shame of Austria and Chancellor Schuschnigg, the shame of Czechoslovakia and Beneš, aided and abetted by the Western powers. No resistance, no resistance. But in the Spanish War, this was also the prologue to the real battles which took place later when the Red Army said, we'll smash the invincibility of fascism. But we'd begun to do it in Spain. This is where we did it. And this is where we created the prerequisites for winning the eventual war over fascism. That was the significance.
I've got a British passport, but according to the letters I received when we got back from Spain, I'm not supposed to have a British passport until I repay them the amount of money they expended on my journey home, which I never have done. Incidentally, since then I've served 5 years in the British Army fighting the same enemy, and I really consider that they owe me a few years' soldier's wages, which isn't a great deal, for the fighting I did against the same enemy before they entered the war.
Well, I've been abroad on the same business since, and no one asked me for my fare, referring, of course, to my army service in the Second World War.
And incidentally, there's not a single country in Eastern Europe where wounded international brigaders aren't receiving pensions from their government. In fact, all international brigaders in socialist countries receive pensions from their government. No, wounded, widows, not a single allowance from the British government has ever been paid.
Yes, I do object to the term Spanish Civil War. It was not a civil war. If it had been a civil war, it would have been over in a matter of weeks, because the cities, for the most part, were either held or recaptured by the working people of these cities. It was the first stage of the Second World War, and this was facilitated by non-intervention, which denied the Republic everything, including medical supplies and food.
When I went to Spain, I hated fascism, and it seemed right for me to go and fight it. But I didn't understand the forces which were responsible for the development of fascism. Philosophy was a word for me in a book. Understanding of life, I think, began with my meeting men and women in Spain who really knew what it was about. And I think it's helped me, in fact, I'm sure, I don't think, I know, it's helped me to participate to the full in facing the problems that confronts, first of all, my class, the working class, and the British people in general.
There's a valley in Spain called Jarama. It's a place that we all know so well. It was there that we gave